All right, as people start joining us, you will see us standing here in silence as we let people into the room. So just hang in there and we'll be starting in just about a minute. And as people are just joining us, don't worry, we're about to start. We're just letting people into the room. So sit tight for another few seconds. Khaled, maybe we should get going. We can just let people who arrive late, they'll miss the introductions. They can watch them on the recording.
Great. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. My name is Khaled Elgindy. I'm a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute and director of MEI's Palestine and Palestinian Israeli Affairs program. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you and our amazing panel of experts this morning, looking at Israeli and Palestinian expert perspectives on the UAE-Israel deal. This webinar is part of a two-part series co-organized by the Middle East Institute and our friends at the Foundation for Middle East Peace, co-moderated by myself and FMEP's President Lara Friedman. Just some quick context, as many of you, as all of you should know, on August 13th, President Trump announced that Israel and the UAE had agreed to, quote, finalize a historical peace agreement that would involve normalization of relations between the two countries. Trump stated, not since the Israel-Jordan peace treaty was signed more than 25 years ago has so much progress been made towards peace in the Middle East. We are going to interrogate that statement among other aspects of this discussion. And with that, I'll hand it over to Lara.
Thanks, Khaled. To shed light on today's topic, we have with us three experts from the region. So I'll introduce them very briefly here. They're longer bios for all of our panelists. You can find them on the MEI or the FMEP website pages that are dedicated to today's event. And we'll also be putting into the chat box the Twitter handles of all of our guests. So if you care about the issues we're discussing here, you should definitely be following them. And I think we'll also be putting into the chat box links to their latest articles. So I'm going to introduce people alphabetically, starting with Sam Bahour, a Palestinian-American freelance business consultant working for Applied Information Management based in Al-Bire, Ramallah in Palestine. Sam is well known both for his business initiatives and for his political analysis and commentary in local, regional, and international press, including Haaretz, The Guardian, The New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and more. We're very happy to have you here, Sam. Thank you. Second, we have Marwa Fatafta, who is a policy analyst at Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, working on questions of leadership, governance, and accountability, and an advisory board member of Hamla, the Arab Center for the Advancement of Social Media. Marwa also leads Access Now's work on digital rights in the Middle East and North Africa region as the MENA policy manager. And Marwa, we are also very happy to have you here. And third, we have Elizabeth Tsurkov, who is a fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and a research fellow at the Forum for Regional Thinking. Elizabeth is also a PhD student at Princeton University's Department of Politics. Her work focuses on the Syrian civil war, Iraq, Israel, Palestine, and movements for social change in the Middle East. And her writings have appeared in the New York Times, New York Review of Books, Foreign Policy, 972 Magazine, and others. And Elizabeth, we are very happy to have you with us here as well. Back to you, Khaled.
Thanks, Lara. Just a couple quick housekeeping notes before we dive into our discussion. The format today is going to be a moderator-led discussion with our panelists. In addition to our own questions, we welcome and encourage you, the audience members, to submit your questions directly, which you can do via the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. Feel free to submit questions at any time during the discussion. We'll be keeping an eye on the Q&A box from time to time and try to incorporate as many of your questions into the discussion as we can. Please also note that the webinar is being recorded and will be posted online immediately after it ends. Lastly, if you've got any technical problems, please let us know using the chat function, which is also at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please don't use the chat to submit questions as we may not see them. So a reminder, please use the Q&A function to submit your questions. And with that, let's go ahead and begin.
Great. So I'm going to do the first round of questions, and these are sort of scene setters for all of you. I want to start with Elizabeth. So Elizabeth, you published an article, I think the link is in the box, entitled "The Israel-UAE Deal is a Triumph for Authoritarianism." And the subtitle was "Three Illiberal Leaders Cooked Up a Backroom Deal to Benefit the Political Careers of Two and the Geopolitical Power of the Third." So it was a great article. Everyone should read it. Can you just briefly here lay out your thesis and your thinking on this?
Right, so basically, the deal between the UAE and Israel, largely presented as a peace deal, and by the UAE as a deal intended to stop annexation of parts of the West Bank, is in fact driven by mutual interest, and the mutual interest of all the leaders who are involved in this deal, Trump, Netanyahu, and Bizad, the crown prince of the UAE, is basically keeping the Middle East authoritarian, the common fear of Iran, of political Islam, of political mobilization. And the ties between Israel and the UAE were very much forged based on cooperation in the field of surveillance technology, of intelligence sharing. And this is not used solely against external enemies, such as Iran, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, but also against Emirati citizens. And this is also the foundation for the ties that Israel is maintaining secretly or semi-secretly with other regimes across the region. That is a major foundation for their relationship. So therefore, this deal is a major political success for Netanyahu, for Trump, who are now, facing re-election. It is a big boost for them, and also it benefits the UAE in providing it with an advocate in Washington, AIPAC, and other groups that have a great deal of influence in DC, will now be able to serve also as lobbies for the UAE, as these groups are serving now as lobbies for other Israeli allies, also non-democracies. So therefore, this deal overall benefits these populist authoritarian leaders and comes at the expense, of course, of the Palestinians, but also of the citizens of the Emirates who may wish to use their phones without being spied on.
Thank you. And I know we're going to want to come back to you on some of that. So Sam, turning to you, you recently published an article entitled, it was in Haaretz, entitled "Pushing Palestinians Back to Armed Struggle," in which you described the Israel-UAE deal as a, quote, mere red herring. Picking up maybe on some of the stuff Elizabeth said, can you talk to us about why you think this is the case and what you think this red herring is being used to distract us from?
Sure, and thank you for hosting us. To answer, I need to take a step back so we can look at the larger picture. Let's remind ourselves that the core of this crisis is 73 years of Israeli forced dispossession of Palestinians, which started back in 1948, and subsequently 53 years of Israeli military occupation that started in 1967. These are the words and acts that describe why Israel is unaccepted in this region, the region it resides. And these words and acts have been lost on America, lost on the Trump administration, and we should also note on all past US administrations as well. That's the big picture. Instead of addressing the big real picture at hand, Trump and company produced a theatrical skit called Peace to Prosperity. The skit is promoted by way of a traveling circus led by Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and is currently performing in the UAE. While Israel carries out every day never-ending war crimes in Gaza, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, not allowing refugees to go back to their homes for over 70 years now, the UAE acquiesced in creating what I would call a rather politically childish move, which created a red herring to turn the world's attention not to the Israeli acts that we've been seeing and witnessing and living for the last 7 decades, but to some peace with two parties that were not at war. Only a Trump can do that. What I believe is happening is that the Peace to Prosperity vision that Trump released at the beginning of this year had a first step. That first step was to allow Israel to annex more Palestinian lands of the West Bank. That failed. It fell flat on its face. If they worked in the private sector, they would all be fired. But because they're their own bosses, they've created a celebration of failure in trying to make out the UAE deal as being something which is historic, which I don't think it is. Bottom line, and this is what my Haaretz op-ed tried to argue, is that the Palestinians are being pushed into a smaller and smaller corner, leaving them with very few options. They tried civil disobedience in the first Intifada. They tried 25 years of negotiations through the Oslo peace process, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the fear here is that now facing a frontal attack by the US and Israel, that they may be pushed into the corner to the point where they may use armed struggle to try to get out of that corner. The fear is that this time around, there is no Palestinian leadership willing to adopt an armed struggle strategy. So what we're going to possibly end up with is individual acts of violence. And that's what we're seeing every day. And that's much more dangerous than any kind of political violence. Not that violence is a solution to anything here.
So that is a great segue to Marwa. So Marwa, I wanted to ask you about the piece that you recently co-authored. It was an Al-Shabaka piece entitled, Why Palestinians Need to Reclaim the PLO. And in that piece, you observe, it opens with the observation that the Israel-UAE deal is, quote, I'm quoting, further evidence of the leadership's inability to influence events that shape the fate of the Palestinian people. So can you talk about what you think Palestinians can or should do to reclaim the PLO? And actually also, I'd be interested in knowing why you believe a reclaimed PLO is the right vehicle for Palestinians to achieve their rights.
Yeah, thanks, Lara, for hosting us. I mean, so the UAE-Israel deal coming on the heels of Israel's annexation plan, on top of a context of a global pandemic, exposed once again the extent to which the Palestinian leadership is incapable of protecting the rights of Palestinians, of protecting the Palestinian land. Israel is expanding its settler colonial project on a daily basis, while now normalizing its ties with Arab states based on common geopolitical interests, as Elizabeth pointed out. And the Palestinian leadership is merely reacting with verbal reactions that have no bearing on the ground and with very little consequences. And so, it's important to note here that the trajectory which the Palestinian leadership took since the signing of Oslo and the decades after, which, kind of reduced the Palestinian liberation movement or the Palestinian national movement from a liberation movement to self-determination, freedom, and justice, to this technocratic state building project based on this failed two-state paradigm. And they're desperately clinging to this stillborn child, which is completely, of course, divorced from the reality on the ground, is divorced from and disconnected from the Palestinian polity. So Palestinians living in the occupied territories, Palestinians living in refugee camps, Palestinians living in diaspora, who have been over the decades also excluded from many of those discussions. And so, we've been saying for years that there is a leadership crisis, that the Palestinian leadership is unable to get us out of this political dead end. And so the question that is yet to be answered is, where do we go from here? So in light of these developments, we at Al-Shabaka try to, come together and think of future scenarios and rethink our political system and rethink of our governance body to come up with a representative, democratic Palestinian leadership that is able to connect again with the Palestinian communities, that is able to act on their behalf and in their best interest. And to come to that, to answer that question, how do we come to an alternative? The simple basic conclusion is that there needs to be a consensus building mechanism for all Palestinians to come under one roof or under one umbrella, despite, we're politically dispersed, we're geographically dispersed. So we need that kind of roof, we need that kind of umbrella for us to come together and rethink our our leadership, we rethink our political framework, rethink of our political program. Where are we going from here? And we think that actually the PLO does have that mandate. It's been dormant over the years or the last few decades, especially after the Oslo agreements and the PA kind of dominating and taking over the PLO and rendering it over the years as a ineffective, dysfunctional, and largely disconnected governance body. But at the end of the day, the PLO does have that mandate, and I think it still had kept some of its legitimacy, especially among Palestinians living in the diaspora, where they think that obviously the PLO is their legitimate representative. And I think, it is about time for us to revive and reclaim the PLO. It's not the ultimate end. I should emphasize that it may be coming together as Palestinians, rethinking our future. We might come to a scenario where the PLO is no longer needed. But in order for us to decide on a political program, we need to revive one governing body that we have. And that is the PLO. And in the Al-Shabaka report and in the foreign policy piece, we emphasize a number of pillars, which I'm happy to discuss later down the discussion. But it is important for us as Palestinians to come together to have the PLO as an inclusive body. So we can't just have one political party dominating the scene. Other political factions need to be involved in the PLO, as well as other independent figures. It is important for the PLO to be accountable, to have elections. The PNC, or the Palestinian National Council, that is supposed to be the parliament of all Palestinians. I'm 35 years old. I've never have elected a leader in my life, a Palestinian leader. And I think it's important for us to kind of think, okay, we need to be able to elect our representatives. We need to be able to hold them accountable, to correct course, to have a say in events that at the end of the day, such as the UAE-Israel deal, we are the ones to pay the price for. And right now, as it seems, we are just we are spectators. We have no say in that deal. And unfortunately, looking at the PLO or the Palestinian leadership reactions, I don't think that would change anytime soon.
Thanks, Marwa. Thank you all. I want to probe a little bit deeper on some of the things that you each have already brought up. It seems pretty clear, based on what you've told us, each of you, that the conflict is in a way being redefined by the Trump administration, by the current Israeli government, and with the aid and support of many in the region. It's being redefined away from the Palestinian issue being at the core of what we used to call the Arab-Israeli conflict. and now somehow it's being sort of pushed from the outside in, which is clearly a deliberate process or a deliberate approach by this administration and by the Israeli government. Marwa, I wanted to ask you specifically in terms of the Palestinian leadership's response to this. You kind of hinted that it's been an inadequate response, but tell us what the response has been so far and what, in your view, it should have been. What could have been the response if it, what should have been a more effective response by the Palestinian leadership, given the weakness, inherent weakness of the Palestinians compared with other actors in the region?
Yeah, thanks, Khaled. So yeah, the Palestinian leadership, namely the president and leaders of Palestinian factions, of course, reacted to the deal and unanimously rejected it. So President Abbas, a few days after the Trump's announcement, he held a meeting or a conference of the Palestinian leadership and Palestinian factions in Ramallah, including Hamas and Islamic Jihad in opposition to the plan. And he described it as and I quote, a stab in the back of the Palestinian cause. I mean, interestingly, in his speech, he tried, I think, to downplay the significance of this normalization deal, citing that, the international community has strongly opposed Trump's plan and Israel's annexation plan. And he kind of tried to frame the UAE-Israel deal as an event happening on the periphery of the international community's position. So he also tried to kind of reassure or reiterate that the Palestinian leadership is committed to the international law framework, that they're committed to the previous agreements with Israel and the decisions of Arab and Islamic summits. And I quote, no matter what happens. So he repeatedly said, no matter what happens, we Palestinians, the Palestinian leadership, are committed to our agreements, are committed to the decisions of these summits before, in a way to try to frame that those, Israel and the UAE are the bad guys, but look at us, we are the good ones here, still holding our fort, we're still trying to cling again. I think, I think that is, to me, a clear indication that the leadership is still in denial, that, you can't bet anymore on these actors. I mean, definitely not the US and clearly now also not on Arab governments, but somehow they're still trying to, cling to that two-state solution paradigm and thinking, again, in a way like reducing their agency, saying that the international community has our back. We've known their position on the Trump's plan and the annexation plan, and therefore, no matter what happens there between the UAE and Israel, we're fine, we're good. I think, it's, in addition to it being in denial and obviously also disappointing, because 3 months prior to this speech, the Abbas came out and in response to the annexation plan said that all agreements with Israel are actually null and void. So essentially, he walked back from that statement. And I also think, in a way, it's a misreading of the geopolitical dynamics and the shift in the Arab government's discourse and attitudes towards the Palestinian cause post the Arab Spring, so post 2011, which I think is a gross miscalculation that, again, Palestinians will pay costly the price for it. Because I think, the Palestinian cause, to a certain extent, has been used by Arab dictators and Arab regimes in the past, as a propaganda fig leaf, right? So to portray themselves as these anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, anti-Zionist heroes. And with the fall of Arab regimes, so the likes of Gaddafi and the likes of Saddam and so on, the Palestinian cause, I think, had kind of lost its centrality. So as Arab governments are sinking deeper into their own conflicts and their own issues, the Palestinian cause had kind of took a sideline or sidetracked. But, we've also been observing the past few years some orchestrated online campaigns and government trolls, especially coming from the Gulf region, that attempt to dehumanize the Palestinians and delegitimize the Palestinian cause. So, we've seen many campaigns portraying a Palestinian as someone who betrayed their cause, as someone who had sold his or her land for money. That Palestinian leadership is, are a bunch of beggars just asking for sympathy and support, while acting as contractors for the Israeli occupation, and using that to kind of desensitize or pave the way for having the Palestinian cause delegitimized, and therefore, thinking that building a new alliance between the UAE or any other Gulf state and Israel is the way forward. Why should they stop cooperating with one of the region's best defense and surveillance and exporter in exchange for helping Palestinians? And so I think, in a way, reading the situation closely, that deal was pretty much on its way, and the Palestinian leadership hasn't been able to anticipate that or take effective actions or take measures that respond to the aftermath or the consequences of such deal.
Thanks, Marwa. I noticed we have one of our questioners who's asking in the wrong place in the chat box, but there's a question about the Israeli perspective. We have two Palestinian perspectives, but let's hear a little bit more. Elizabeth, can you tell us a little bit on where Israelis are on this historic deal? We saw just yesterday this historic flight from Tel Aviv to the UAE, flying over Saudi airspace, which is all very new, and there was a considerable amount of fanfare. How is this being received domestically in Israel? Is it as big as it's being made out to be?
First, I would say that the majority of the Israeli public supports the deal, and supports also how the deal is being presented. Is essentially, there's not going to be annexation, and instead we're going to have, this peace deal with the UAE. So it is popular. Polls, however, show conflicting results with regards to the impact on Netanyahu's standing. One TV channel said that helped, the other said it didn't help. I think in general, it's very difficult to poll right now in Israel, because the story that continues to dominate people's lives is the coronavirus outbreak and just how horribly it is being handled in Israel. And I think that, the boost to both Netanyahu and Trump politically from this deal was intended in a way to ameliorate this significant deterioration in their political standing in recent months because of their terrible mishandling of the outbreak. Obviously, in the U.S., the situation is significantly worse than in Israel, but Israel too has quite a large number of cases. Today, the largest number of new cases ever recorded happened in Israel, just as schools are reopening. So things are not likely to get significantly better. So I would say that the deal was quite popular in Israel, and also helped reinforce the message that the Israeli right has been pumping for years, and has been saying for years to, not even years, even generations, that, we as Israel just need to remain strong, not given an inch, and eventually our neighbors, Arab countries, will recognize that Israel is powerful, cannot be militarily defeated, and then we will be able to make peace for peace, not peace for concessions. And the behavior of Gulf regimes in recent years, the gradual normalization, and now this deal that makes this normalization, official, not just, meetings at conferences and leaked videos and leaked information, but actually makes it official, is a significant boost to the Israeli right, and a vindication. Israel can get away with continuing to expand settlements, continuing to maintain a blockade on Gaza. It does not need to even pretend to negotiate with the Palestinian Authority. There are no negotiations happening whatsoever. Like, the leaders refuse to meet even. And yet Israel is able to achieve this normalization. So hence, overall, I'd say that the immediate impact has been that the deal is popular. It is unclear how it affects Netanyahu's standing, but overall, it is further boosting the narrative of the Israeli right and weakening the Israeli left, which has been warning for years. If Israel keeps this up, if Israel keeps up the occupation, Israel will become isolated. There will be BDS. There will be sanctions. There will be, countries will refuse to improve relations with us. The economy will stagnate. And in reality, this has not happened. And this is significantly weakens the Israeli left, which is really not able to provide the Israeli public with a clear narrative as to why they should be elected, why they should come in office. And we see the results of that in recent elections. Basically, the Israeli left is incredibly weak, and I'd say in its weakest state in many, many years.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Turning back to you, Sam, where does all of this leave the Palestinians and the Palestinian issue? Has the Palestinian issue lost its currency and its resonance in the Arab world, even as it sort of gains currency in other parts of the Middle East, but even in the West, in the United States and in Europe? Is that shift happening? Do Arabs still care about Palestine? And where does all of this leave the Palestinians going forward?
Thank you, Khaled. Before I answer your question, I'd like just to comment on Elizabeth, what she said. In terms of the annexation, only yesterday, Netanyahu announced yet again that annexation is on. Not only that, he will launch the Israeli school season from a settlement inside the West Bank, a school in a settlement inside the West Bank. So the Israeli plans for annexation have to be, I think, taken as they're saying it, and not maybe as Jared Kushner and Trump would like to understand it, or the UAE for that matter. Also, historically, if we look at Israel, there has always been two schools of thought in the Israeli political system. One is the inside out, and the other is the outside in. Let's make deals with the outside to put pressure on the Palestinians, and others saying, let's work with the Palestinians and hopefully it opens up the Arab world to us. So this model is not actually changing much in terms of the dynamics that we're very used to here. In terms of your question of where this leaves the Palestinians amongst the Arab world, I must say in a strategic sense, I think very little has changed. Before this deal, the heartland of the Arab peoples were squarely on the right side of history and in support of Palestinian struggle for freedom and independence. After the deal, they remain in full support. So nothing has really changed in the modality of the relationship between the Palestinian people and the Arab people. That noted, the deal highlights something that the Palestinians have known and articulated since I have been born, which is that the Arab regimes do not represent their citizens. They are non-democratic and merely pay lip service to the Palestinian struggle, and maybe sometimes offer a fraction of 1% of their financial wealth from their petroleum economies, mainly to appease their citizenry, because they understand very well that their populations, these Arab countries' populations, are squarely behind the Palestinian struggle. If we were in Latin America, we would be calling these banana republics. Because we're here in the Middle East, especially if we talk about the Gulf, we can call them petro republics. They are non-representative by any stretch of the imagination. The deal does not shake for a moment the mutual solidarity between Palestinians and the Arab world. We are still in mutual solidarity with the people of Iraq, which was decimated by the US. We are still in mutual solidarity with the people and children of Yemen, which as we speak is being bombed by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Partly why the UAE wants better airfare, planes, is to be able to bomb in a more efficient fashion. Those regimes have been the same stale regimes over time. Trump came to put them in fear of losing their thrones. Thus, they are going out of their way to appease a specific US administration, which is threatening them to reveal them for what they are. But that has really no relation between the Arab people and the Palestinian people. Not much has changed there. If we look at the US, actually a lot is changing in the US, thanks to all of your work as well. The US, if we look at the Democratic Party as one encapsulated polling pool, we can see that Democrats across the US have increasingly become more supportive and understanding, because education was a big deal here. If you don't know something, it's easy to be against it. The more education infiltrated the US churches and solidarity community and political parties, the more younger generation of Americans are aligning with the Palestinian struggle. And if we look at Black Lives Matter and the minority community in the US and other women movements, LGBTQ movements, they have all played a role in amplifying the ability for the American populace to actually be supportive of the Palestinians. So if we look at the American community, we can see that the US administration is not much different today than those Arab regimes. They are not representative of the peoples of the US. Actually, we have numbers from the last US presidential elections to prove that our president in the US is not a representative president in terms of popular vote. So things are moving in a positive direction in terms of support. What we need is to be able to convert that support to leverage to hold Israel accountable. Ultimately, the act of holding Israel accountable is what will make it change its ways. And we're doing the hard grunt work with all the communities that are in solidarity with us to try to make that happen. We need a better leadership to lead in that, and that's what we're all working on, and I'll speak about that in a little bit as well.
Thanks, Sam. And for folks who are interested in the issue of attitudes in the Arab world and also in the United States, we are doing another webinar tomorrow, which will, amongst our guests, feature someone who's done polling for years across the Arab world and in the US. So this is something we'll be looking at tomorrow. Check the MEI or FMEP website and please sign up and join us for that conversation as well. I want to use this round to talk a little bit more about annexation. It's come up in the previous rounds. People have mentioned it. This idea, you know, the UAE is, again, some of the statements coming out yesterday during the visit about how the UAE is still supportive of a Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital, and really framing this as a courageous deal that was done to save the Palestinians by forestalling annexation. And I want to have all of you talk a little bit about what this means on the ground. And I want to start with you, Sam. This idea of suspending annexation and what it means, the de facto versus de jure. You're sitting there in Ramallah. We're seeing the view of Al-Bire behind you. I know that behind your left shoulder and to the left a little bit, we could see the settlement of Pezagod if the view is bigger. Can you talk to us about what suspending annexation does or doesn't mean? And did the UAE get hoodwinked here with the term suspension, or is this, you know, sort of going along with it, knowing that it isn't really meaningful?
Good question. I mean, given Netanyahu did not even let the ink on whatever they agreed to dry before announcing that it's still on the table, they're more than hoodwinked. We here are living the process of annexation every single day. This is not a new phenomenon that has hit us with Trump or with Netanyahu. It's been a decades-long process. But let's start by calling annexation what it is, because the word annexation has taken a soft connotation. Annexation is land theft by military force. It starts with controlling, occupying, economic strangulation, pillaging of natural resources, instilling constant fear into entire generations, sieging an entire area like the Gaza Strip, arresting every single night, torturing prisoners, house demolitions, settlements. Do I need to go on? That process is what culminates in what we call technically de jure annexation. It's taking the reality that what I just mentioned creates, and then when everybody's tired of talking about all those things, changing the legal status to make it real. It's real every day for us. Ask the person who was tortured in the Israeli jails if it was real 5 years ago. It was real. So finding that culminating into an act of annexation is not something which is so grand. And that's maybe why we're not seeing people flooding the streets here, because our struggle is a long, prolonged one. And we are tired as well. And our leadership, which was spoken about, is not doing a good job in making us motivated to do more than we have to. But we are doing a lot on the ground. Let's not think the Palestinians are sitting and watching and observing this happening. Every single day, our farmers are out trying to plant trees, which are uprooted by the Israelis. Kids are trying to go to school through checkpoints. So all of this together, the last final act is called annexation. My fear is that the threat of annexation, whether it's suspended or not, let's put that on the shelf for a second. The mere threat of annexation, which the UN Charter, actually section 2.4 of the UN Charter, claims is a war crime. You are not allowed to threaten the integrity of another territory. So this, again, it's pushing the Palestinians into a corner where we're not going to have any ability to do anything but fight back in ways which may have not been seen yet. Because one thing I can guarantee for sure, the Palestinians are not going to vanish in thin air. And we proved that by a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. And to be honest with you, some very keen political decisions as well. As bad as our leadership is, I don't throw the baby with the bathwater. They brought us to a point today where saying you're Palestinian is accepted. That wasn't accepted back in the 70s and the 60s. So we came a long way. My generation and the younger generation of Palestinians have a lot to thank the Palestinian leadership historically for. It's up to us now to take the reins of that leadership in this very complicated world of ours and try to explain this very simple conflict. We have an occupier and an occupied, violating international law every day. How do we change that scenario? We hold the occupier accountable. And that's what we're trying to do. So suspending annexation for a couple of months or not, even though they announced yesterday that it's still on the table, is actually means very little to me. It's more important for me to be able to see the comprehensive bigger picture that this Israeli boot has been on our neck for 53 years at least. And it's time for it to come off. Totally.
Thanks. And picking up on that, Marwa, so I think Sam has laid out incredibly well why annexation is sort of itself a red herring, the term annexation. But you know, the idea that now that Israel has announced it's suspended or not, but officially suspended. Yesterday they were also saying it's still suspended, even as Bibi was saying it's still on the table. You know, how do the Palestinians keep the world focused on what's actually happening on the ground, right? This de facto de jure question. Right after the UAE deal happened, we saw Europe making motions to, okay, you've suspended annexation, now we can start moving forward on other wonderful benefits. How do Palestinians keep the world's eye? How does the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, whatever the leadership is, keep people's eye on the ball, which is what's actually happening on the ground?
I think Sam brilliantly summarized what annexation mean. And again, you know, to emphasize that this annexation suspension is a blatant lie. It's a daily reality. And I think even if Netanyahu decides to pause for a month or two, it's a game of time, probably for political scoring. So if he doesn't move tomorrow, he will move in a few months whenever he thinks it suits his political agenda. But I mean, to also build on what Sam mentioned, I think, you know, also it's very important to, you know, while our leadership is out of shape, but you know, it's important to note that the Palestinian communities have been resilient, and they're, you know, in mobilizing against the harsh realities and violence, daily violence happening in Palestine, and also outside of Palestine, you know, in refugee camps and in the diaspora. This constant mobilization, constant activism by young Palestinians trying to share the Palestinian story in many different ways to keep it on on people's agenda and to keep it on people's minds. There are a lot of activism online, lots of campaigns trying to link, Palestinian struggle to also international struggles, to Black Lives Matters, and highlight the solidarity with other international movements and the reason why we need to link up these struggles, because at the end of the day, what Sam mentioned, like how can we hold Israel accountable? Obviously, I still insist that the leadership has a big role to play, because how can we tap into those reservoirs of youth mobilization and grassroots movements, which again, the leadership is here, and the Palestinian younger generations and grassroots movements are here, and these are completely disconnected with two different narratives. And again, I think it is important through the PLO or through any other mechanisms that the political playing field is open to those younger actors to come forward. And fortunately, over the years, there have been increasing authoritarian trends, which doesn't allow Palestinians to speak up their minds, which doesn't allow Palestinians to even take, let's say, official part in Palestinian politics. So the political actors are known, we know their faces for many, many generations. And I think it's important to break that silo and allow for other younger Palestinians to take active part, not only on on grassroots movements, but learning from our history, both during the first Intifada and in the great years of the PLO in the 60s and the 70s, where the Palestinian leadership was connected to the communities, and there was that synergy between groups acting on the ground and the leadership. And I think it's important for us to forge these links again. And again, these developments, whether it's this annexation or the UAE-Israel deal, I think there's silver lining, to borrow the cliche, that it is really a time for us as Palestinians to stop and self-reflect and to get our house back in order, and to rethink, also to borrow my friend and colleague Ziada Hawari's words. We need to think and allow ourselves to think radically and about our future, and not just about what could possibly happen post Abbas, which is often the frequently asked question, but to go be ambitious in our imagination and a little bit radical in imagining really the future we deserve as Palestinians, and how can we really bring an end to this ongoing violence and occupation on a daily basis.
Thank you. And I would recommend for folks who have not read it, Lara Hawari has a really powerful and challenging piece on exactly this. It's on the Al-Shabaka website. It's very much well worth reading. Elizabeth, I want to ask you. So I want to ask you two questions, really. One, on the annexation question, you mentioned that Israelis are largely pretty happy about the UAE deal. It took annexation off the table as far as they're concerned. I want to know, do they care about annexation? And this is something that has come up in the question of, was there going to be a fourth election, which has been forestalled? How much is this even really an issue? Or is it basically, are people agnostic? Do it, don't do it, we don't care, we just want things to be better? And also, you have written about, and I pulled up a piece, I think we'll put it into the chat box. You wrote a piece a while ago for, actually for MEI, entitled "Gulf Regimes May Oppose Annexation, but They Helped Bring It About." And I'd like you to actually sort of flesh that out as well. What is the role of the Arab world, and particularly the Gulf, in enabling, facilitating, or passively giving a green light to annexation this whole time anyway?
Right, thank you. So the issue of annexation, interestingly, was quite marginal in Israeli public discourse until relatively recently, particularly before the second election in the third in the series of elections that Israel had. Netanyahu just looking, he always does this, shortly before the elections, he puts out some information to basically get the voters of far-right parties to switch and vote Likud. He has done this again and again. Usually it's been quite racist, kind of basically misinformation about Arabs coming in droves. It's dangerous. If Gantz gets elected, there will be a government with Ahmed Tibi and things like that. And before the second round of elections, and then the third again, he mentioned it again, Netanyahu brought up annexation as basically, I will go ahead and annex parts of the West Bank if I'm elected. And in fact, reporting by Ben Caspit showed that Netanyahu actually intended to carry out an annexation of the Jordan Valley, but was basically pushed away from doing so by the leadership of Israel's opposition, which is not the political opposition, which is useless, but actually the military establishment. Basically, the IDF and the Shin Bet are the moderating force now, the main moderating force on the Israeli government for years, on issues also that pertain to the blockade on Gaza, for example. So therefore, Netanyahu did not go through with the annexation, but made those statements. And once it became kind of more part of discourse, we saw Israelis gradually shifting more in favor of the annexation, whereas it used to be really kind of this fringe idea popular among the settler right, not really anyone else. And yet the success of the deal and its welcoming by the Israeli public indicates that at the end of the day, Israelis still prefer kind of peace, a sense of normalization, as opposed to annexation. It was a no-brainer, and most Israelis supported, giving up annexation to have peace with the UAE. And this actually is a good indication of the fact that the Israeli population, still when polled, shows support for the two-state solution. It may be unrealistic, it may be seen by many as unjust, but at the end of the day, Israelis do want peace. They do not want to continue living in a constant state of conflict. However, particularly since the Second Intifada, the Israeli public came to very clearly prioritize matters of security over peace. And the Israeli right has been able to promise to the Israeli public that we will provide you with security, while the Israeli left kept trying to present itself to the Israeli public saying, we will give you peace, and also tried at the same time to claim that we will also give you security. And it's no coincidence that the leaders of the Israeli left or center who've been successful in actually becoming prime minister in recent decades have all been men with a security background. So Rabin, Barak, and Sharon have all been, ministers of defense, chiefs of staff. The Israeli public clearly prioritizes security, but at the same time wishes for peace. And then in recent years, with the movement towards normalization, that Israel would be sure to, for example, there was this conference, I think it was in Prague, and someone from the prime minister's office recorded a video of the Bahraini foreign minister and leaked the video, put it up on YouTube, like to show, normalization is happening constantly. Israeli officials would say like, oh, we have relations with so many different countries and we can't name them, etc. This was intended to project to the Israeli public is that the right is able not only to provide Israelis with security, but also provide it with peace. So therefore, the Arab Gulf regimes that are normalizing relations with Israel, whether doing it, full-blown normalization as the UAE has done, or other regimes that are, allowing Israeli officials to enter their countries, are meeting them at conferences, are, conducting cooperation that is relatively open and known to the public, they are boosting the Israeli right. The Israeli right can now relatively credibly claim, right, that it is able to provide security. Palestinian violence is at an all-time low, while at the same time, it is able to provide peace. It's true that the peace is not with the Palestinians, who are actually there and will always remain there, and the ones that Israel should be trying to reach a peace deal with, but it is providing peace with other Arab countries, with Chad, maybe with Sudan, far removed countries, but it is a form of peace, while at the same time providing security. What is the left able to deliver? Nothing. The left, in the view of majority of Israelis, has failed to provide them with security. And the threats about kind of the negative consequences of the occupation have largely not borne out. Therefore, this move of normalization by Arab Gulf regimes is significantly boosting the Israeli right and ensuring that it will remain in power. And the right remaining in power means that there will never be an end to the occupation. So they are themselves undermining a goal that they purport to support, an ending of the occupation. As long as the right remains in power in Israel, this will not happen. And again, this is why we're seeing Netanyahu again reiterating and possibly lying. He is known to be a liar, saying that I did not take annexation off the table, etc., etc. This is to appease his base. He does not want to be attacked, next elections, when trying to compete for voters of the Israeli far right. But at the end of the day, whether annexation happens officially or unofficially, as previous speakers mentioned, in reality, the reality on the ground is of annexation, is of continued settlement construction, is of continued expropriation of land. And at the end of the day, this is what matters. And therefore, the international community or Europeans saying, this is excellent and annexation is off the table. No, I mean, great, it's not official, but the reality on the ground is still one that is intolerable. And this is something that should not be tolerated by international actors who purport to support human rights.
I just want to comment, just listening to you, it's interesting to me, when people lay out all the reasons the left has lost, because now the right can say, we get in peace without it, we can have economic benefits. At the point years ago when the left said, we're not going to talk about ending the occupation based on right and wrong and what's morally correct, and it's wrong to occupy, we're going to start laying out all these pragmatic reasons. It's sort of like they gave it away because, those pragmatic reasons, fine. So if there's no moral basis for doing the right thing, then people can say, well, you're wrong, we've lost, we can make you secure without it. It's quite striking for me, who's old enough to remember this evolution in the speech of the Israeli peace camp. It's a little bit breathtaking and heartbreaking.
Right.
Sorry, Khaled, I jumped in.
No, I'll just say that I've actually had arguments with a major kind of center-left organization that their entire campaign ahead of an election, they're a body that is not officially not a political body, was entirely focused on interest. And I was asking them, like, why aren't you trying to, for example, humanize Palestinians and say that, they deserve human rights just as much as we Israelis do? And they're like, it doesn't poll well, it's not effective. We need to talk to them about the fact that it is harming the economy, that, the fact that we have wars every few years is harmful because tourists are not coming over and it's creating instability and no one wants to invest. As opposed to telling them, Palestinians have the right to protest, to assembly, to choose their elected representatives, et cetera, et cetera. So apparently morals don't sell well.
Yeah, I think that's probably not too surprising. I think it's morality is hard to sell in any political context. But I want to shift gears a little bit and look at what comes next. So we're looking at the future. Elizabeth, what kinds of political dividends do you expect this deal to pay off for Gulf states, for the Israelis in particular? And if I could, do you expect other countries to follow suit? You mentioned Sudan, Chad. We've heard also about Bahrain and some other, Oman and others in the region. And if I could tack on a question that's in the Q&A section that's somewhat related. How does the so-called Abraham Accord differ from previous Arab-Israeli agreements, most notably Egypt and Israel and the Jordan-Israel peace treaty?
Right. So first, to briefly mention, to answer the second question, it differs. First of all, the agreement with Egypt was land for peace. There is nothing of that kind in this deal. Even in the case of Jordan, the peace deal very much, first of all, provided Jordan with greater influence over particularly in Jerusalem, like it enshrined their role. in the management of holy sites for the Muslims. And in addition to that, it was clearly that deal kind of took off the option of the so-called Jordan option, which is, basically that the Palestinian state would be in Jordan, which is a dream of the Israeli far right, not even far right. So therefore, that deal was conducive in some ways to protecting the rights of Palestinians, even if in a very kind of limited way. In the case of the UAE, there's nothing of that kind. Those deals also, the deal with Egypt, the deal with Jordan, occurred at a time, particularly with Jordan, occurred at a time when there was the sense of hope. There was the Oslo Accords. There was like, we are heading towards the end of the occupation. There are direct negotiations. There are breakthroughs. Israelis and Palestinians are sitting together and speaking. Now there's none of that. I mean, the deal is really based on mutual threat perception. And perceptions of threats, as I mentioned, Iran, Muslim Brotherhood, and the people of the region, and the fear that they will rise up and usher liberalism or Islamism or whatever, just not these authoritarian regimes that are willing to cooperate with Israel. There are additional countries that are rumored to be, in the process of possibly also announcing full normalization. Chad has already normalized relations, and there's talk of Sudan, Oman, and Bahrain coming up next. I think those are it's clear that the Trump administration is desperate for additional successes, given the failure at home and the unrest, as well as the COVID situation. And this is why we're seeing Kushner and we're seeing Pence traveling around trying to convince regimes to accept normalization with Israel ahead of Trump's election. It would definitely be a major boost. It would be really one of the few success stories for Trump domestically or in terms of foreign policy. I mean, he has been quite the failure. And this is something that, even if the speakers here may see some negative externalities or a lot of negative externalities to this deal, it is something that his base is happy about. It is something that, you are increasing the security and acceptance of Israel in the region without giving an inch of land. This is something that clearly the American right, the American evangelicals, by and large, would be quite supportive of. Of course, for Netanyahu, this is again a major success at a time also of decrease in support for him because of the poor handling of the Corona crisis, and also, the corruption scandals, the fact that he's clinging to power even while he is, his trial actually started. And for the UAE, first of all, there is this rumored, F-35 deal. Even if that deal doesn't go through, at the end of the day, what is important now for the UAE is that, first of all, Israeli companies, many of them in the security sector, in the surveillance sector, are now free to conclude deals with the Emirati regime without having to create, shell companies in Europe and Switzerland to try and, it just makes it so much more complicated. Employees who would go on sales visits to the UAE would have to have additional passports. All of this is now gone. You can go and do it, and it's so much easier. It facilitates cooperation and bolstering of ties to a much greater extent. And also, the UAE wants to have a solid ally by its side. And Israel is a solid ally for authoritarian regimes, as opposed to the United States, which is very mercurial. An experience that was very formative for authoritarian regimes across the region was what happened to Mubarak in 2011, when the Americans kind of, the population revolted. They're like, okay, you gotta go. They didn't stand by him. Israel will stand by authoritarian leaders no matter what. It stood by the apartheid regime in South Africa, even when everyone was boycotting it and was shipping weapons to it. It will stand by the Emirati regime no matter what, no matter war crimes in Yemen or whatever. And it has the clout in Washington to not only for Israel to support it, but also to work in DC to advance the interests of the UAE when it comes to the war in Yemen, when it comes to additional measures against Iran. And just when it comes to improving the image of this country, that is highly authoritarian and is engaged in a bloody conflict in Yemen that, entails the starvation of millions of people and the destruction of, health infrastructure and basic infrastructure in a country in the midst of a pandemic.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I'm conscious of our limited time. I just want to turn now to Marwa, and if I could ask both Marwa and Sam to be as brief as you can, so that we can try to fit in as many questions as we can. So Marwa, how do you this cooperation between Israel and the UAE, particularly in the security realm and surveillance and intelligence, how do you see that affecting the Palestinians directly? Does it affect the Palestinians directly? And if I could sort of tack on another question that I think is related, we often hear that the part of the peace dividend would be that the UAE would have some leverage over Israeli behavior, let's say in the occupied territories. Is that a valid argument in light of the nature of the cooperation between the two countries?
Yeah, thanks, Khaled. I actually want to expand a little bit on what Elizabeth mentioned in regards to expanding surveillance and security cooperation, and how would that impact Palestinians and also Arab populations in the region in general. I mean, so as we said, this what is touted as a historic deal is actually an exercise of formalizing and labeling already existing ties, including security cooperation and surveillance. And perhaps the most prominent case that comes to mind in recent years was the case of the Emirati human rights defender Ahmed Mansour, who was surveilled by the UAE government using Israeli spyware manufactured and developed by the notorious Israeli NSO group. And this is not the only example. Actually, Haaretz recently published, I think a week ago or so, an article or a piece showing that the UAE and a bunch of other Gulf countries, naming Oman, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, are all clients or favorite clients of the NSO group. So they are the most profitable clients, and therefore they have a dedicated team that caters to their services. That security or surveillance cooperation doesn't stop there. There are numerous examples of Israeli technologies being used and deployed in the UAE to help it monitor and surveil its own citizens. And I think the most dangerous part of that is that most recently also the UAE has ambitions to branch out and develop its own surveillance technologies using Israeli expertise. So there was in 2017, a investigation found that a UAE company, and I believe it's based in Abu Dhabi, called Dark Matter, it tried to lure in a number of ex-Israeli military who worked at the NSO to try help them build up their surveillance technologies. And so I think, with that deal, and as Elizabeth mentioned, now they're not forced to go with foreign passports. They can just go in broad daylight and conclude such business deals without any problem. And of course, where does the UAE use these surveillance technologies? It uses it on its own citizens, on its own residents, and also time and time again, many of investigations of human rights organizations have found that the UAE have been using surveillance technologies to spy on activists and on political leaders in other countries. And so I think, there is a legitimate concern and fear that came out once Trump announced this deal, that these two regimes that have absolutely dismal record of human rights violations and abuses coming together, joining forces in alliance, would lead to the expansion of such surveillance, and again, at whose expense, right? So it is important to point out that all of these technologies developed by Israeli companies and individuals who served in the Israeli army have, that expertise came into being through spying on Palestinians and surveilling them day in, day out. And so, any expansion or any development, again, Palestinians will be used as a test lab for Israel to develop such technologies and then export it later, or help countries like the UAE develop its own. And and to conclude, I think it's very telling that the first official visit following the announcement was from the head of Israeli Mossad, and it was a meeting between him and the national security advisor of the UAE. So again, it shows what their priorities are, and obviously for human rights organizations and activists, and it's important to keep an eye out on that space to see what technologies are being developed and where are they used and for what purposes. And I'll stop here.
Thanks, Marwa. Sam, I want to turn to you and ask about the future of Palestinian politics. What does this deal do in terms of the internal political dynamics among Palestinians? Specifically, I know that both Fatah and the PA officially came out, as did Hamas, against the UAE normalization deal, but there is a contingent inside Palestinian politics that seems to be touting the UAE deal and even the Trump plan in particular. I'm referring specifically to a piece that I read in Haaretz by Bishara Bahbah over the weekend, if any of you saw it, in which he's making that case. And he's argued in the past for, let's give the Trump plan a chance. How prevalent is this view, and what do you think is behind it, given where the rest of Palestinian politics is?
I would say first that we need to keep in mind that the Palestinian people are a crisis-oriented people. It doesn't give me a lot of pride to say that, but that's what we are. We act when we are absolutely in need of acting, at least from the leadership perspective. Let's break down for a second the different responses. First, the PLO. The PLO, in its weak leadership, with its elderly leadership, finally took a strong response in reaction to the annexation plan, and then in follow-up to this UAE deal. Actually, I believe that strong Palestinian formal official position is what stopped annexation. It's not the UAE flirting with Trump in hopes to buy some new F-35 toys. It was the Palestinian position being very clear for the first time in a very, very long time, which mobilized the global community, like every single country in the world, to stand up and say annexation is wrong, it should not happen. And at the end of the day, it got, for example, the EU, which is a very conservative, as we know, outfit, to start the discussion about sanctioning Israel. They're far away from doing that, but the sheer discussion put Israel into shock. If we do this, we're going to be finally held accountable. So that whether it's the annexation or the UAE deal, the Palestinian leadership, very, very late in the game, came through with a solid position. I'm not holding my breath that it's going to stick for a very long time, because they are under tremendous pressure financially, politically, and otherwise. On the other level here is the Palestinian Authority. And a lot of people conflate those two organizations. The Palestinian Authority is an administrative body that was born out of the Oslo Accords, which is responsible for administering the day-to-day affairs of those of us who are living under military occupation. What does that mean? It's responsible for healthcare, for fixing our streets and municipal government, and for our education system. I'm not looking for the PA for political leadership on the global stage. On the Palestinian popular response, of course, the popular response has been fuming. They have been watching and seeing and yelling at the top of their voice at the highest mountains to the Palestinian leadership that it's time to act. Not this year, not when Trump was elected, even prior. And they're fuming at two sides of this issue. One is at Israel, because Israel's actually doing what it's always been doing, but also at the Palestinian leadership for coming around to their senses a little bit too late in the game. And so the Palestinian population at large, as far as my circles, and I'm out there, is united. And not only united in Palestine, in terms of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. But inside Israel, the Palestinian citizens of Israel have been very vocal. And for the first time ever, we're hearing strong voices coming from the Palestinian diaspora and refugee community. So if there's any silver lining in the Trump administration's attack on the Palestinians, he got us into crisis mode and he woke up the Palestinian dragon of the diaspora and the refugee community that the Palestinian leadership had put to sleep for a very long time. With all of those entities now wide awake, seeing that we are facing the annihilation of the Palestinian struggle, we are coming together. Palestinians are a very political people. When we see that this frontal attack on our struggle is real and it's nonstop, Palestinians will come together with all of their political differences to deal with the priority at hand. But what will come after this is making sure that there's a reforming of the Palestinian political agency to be more representative. 2 points to end on here. One is we need the world to understand, especially those who are in solidarity with us more than anyone else, that we need to respect Palestinians have internal politics. Yes, we're like everyone else. The good news is, if you're not Palestinian, you don't have to lose sleep about that. And you don't have time to lose sleep, for example, if you're an American, because you have your own internal issues you need to take care of. Having internal issues is a Palestinian issue. In terms of our struggle and its relationship to the global community, there is no cloudiness or unclarity in our address. The Palestine Liberation Organization, the state of Palestine, is sitting at the UN. They have an office, they have a desk. Anyone wanting to deal with the Palestinians knows exactly where to knock. And that's important because if there's an address and no one is knocking the door, it's not the Palestinians who don't want to engage for the sake of ending this. And I would also say that we're no longer in the mood to talk about a solution. That was the 25 years of Oslo. We were hoping that a bilateral engagement would reach a joint solution. That didn't work. Right now, I don't know what the solution is going to be, but I know that we have a state on paper in the UN recognized by the majority of the world, and there's a boot of occupation on its neck. We need to mobilize to get our state to be free in order for us to be able to breathe and engage the Israelis over time to figure out how we're going to live together. So my national liberation through statehood is not the end game, but it's a necessary step at this point, given Israel has proven beyond a reasonable doubt with the US support that they have no intention whatsoever to negotiate their way out of this military occupation.
Well, that is a really powerful set of statements from all of our panelists to end on, and we do have to end. We said 12:15 and it's almost, we're just barely past that. I wish we could go on longer. This was terrific. On behalf of the Foundation for Middle East Peace and the Middle East Institute, I want to thank all of our panelists for being so generous with their time and their analysis and in appearing here today. I want to thank everybody who tuned in and especially those who asked questions. If your question was not asked, rest assured we will be sharing all of the questions. We will email the list of all the questions to our panelists so that they know what people are interested in and maybe can address it in other writing that they do. If you want to learn more about the issues we've been discussing today, again, follow our panelists on Twitter, check their writings online, and check our website, fmep.org or middleeastinstitute.org for more information, and also to RSVP for tomorrow's webinar, which will be looking at these same issues with US experts. Again, this is part one of a two-part webinar. Tomorrow's will also be at 11 o'clock. Thank you, Khaled, my co-moderator. And with